Hello students, let's continue chapter 11 by looking at other endocrine glands. We made it through the pituitary glands. Now let's look at the thyroid gland. Now here's a model that you need to know about. Here's where the Adam's apple is, the voice box, the larynx. And if you move down here, you see one lobe of the thyroid. The thyroid has two lobes connected by an isthmus, and on this model you see the thyroid gland here. Now on this model you also see a tear gland, you see parotid glands. These are different types of glands. These glands produce saliva with enzymes to help break down carbohydrates. Okay, and then here the thyroid. Now the thyroid is made up of follicular cells, and then with around this space, this colloid is fluid filled and sometimes has some of the hormones that's produced by the thyroid, but there are two different types of hormones produced by the follicular cells that we'll look at in just a minute, T3 and T4, and then extrafollicular cells, those outside of the area of the follicular cells, extrafollicular, calcitonin is produced here. Thyroxine is T4. Triiodothyronine is the second thyroid hormone produced by those follicular cells. Now when they do a blood test, they'll test for T4 and T3 to make sure that the levels are adequate to regulate metabolism. A person who is hypothyroid or has hypothyroidism has an underactive thyroid gland, and these are not being produced. These two hormones are not being produced at the level they should be. Now it could be a problem with the thyroid, or remember that the anterior pituitary will release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So sometimes it is a problem that the pituitary gland is not releasing enough thyroid stimulating hormone, and so the thyroid isn't producing enough T3 and T4, and that is indicated by a blood test. Okay, so the blood test will test for TSH and T3 and T4, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Now I see iodine in that word. That's one of the main components of these two hormones is iodine. So you have to have iodine in your diet to help to produce these two particular hormones. Again, anterior pituitary produces TSH, thyroid stimulating hormones, picked up by the bloodstream and carried to the target cells in the thyroid, and the thyroid responds. If thyroid stimulating hormone levels are adequate, thyroid will respond by producing thyroxine and triiodothyronine, and these help to increase metabolism. So a person suffering from hypothyroidism would be tired all the time, may sleep a lot, may gain weight, and have other symptoms of a low metabolism. It's very important. Calcitonin is also released by the thyroid. It is released by those extrafollicular cells outside of those follicular cells, or extrafollicular cells, calcitonin. And its job is to lower blood calcium. Now you've seen this word before or heard about it when we were talking about bones. If it lowers blood calcium, then the calcium in the blood is either added to bone salt helps with the action of osteoblasts. Remember, osteoblasts build bones, and so it will help to deposit that calcium onto the bones, therefore lowering blood calcium levels. It can also be deposited into the kidneys, and the kidneys get rid of it through in the urine with kidney excretion. Okay, it stimulates osteoblasts, so it builds the calcium onto the bone, and it inhibits osteoclast. Remember, osteoclast would break down the bone or resorb the bone. Thyroid gland disorders. We talked about hypothyroidism, which reduces metabolism, weight gain, and causes a person to be lethargic sometimes. But hyperthyroidism is too much of T3 and T4, gives a high metabolic rate, hyperactivity, weight loss, but it also causes protruding eyes and other problems. Cretinism, this is in an adult. Cretinism is hypothyroidism in infants. It leads to small stature and mental retardation. So enough thyroid T3 and T4 are very important for the development of a child or an infant. Now, a goiter, you don't see these very often anymore. They're more in third world countries. It is a deficiency of iodine. Remember, T3 and T4, one of its main components is iodine. T3, 3 iodines, T4, 4 iodines in its chemical makeup. It leads to deficiency of thyroid hormones, and the gland enlarges because of the deficiency of the hormones. Now, how do we get iodine? Iodine is a sufficient amount of iodine is obtained from eating marine fish, saltwater fish. But in the United States, for many years, iodine was added to salt. So when you went to the store and bought salt, you would look on the package and it would say iodinized salt. It means that iodine was added to the salt. Well, some people in the United States may become deficient in iodine because when you buy sea salt or Malaysian salt or some of these naturally occurring salts, they're not usually iodinized. So you are not getting the iodine from the salt. Okay? And if a person is not eating enough fish, saltwater fish, they may not be getting enough iodine in their diet, and a goiter could develop. Now, there are other foods that have a trace amount of iodine in them, but not many. So it is a concern with our new fascination with sea salt and other type of naturally occurring salts. Now, the parathyroid. This is the posterior view. We saw pictures of the thyroid. Well, this is on the back side of the thyroid, and there are 4 lobular shaped glands. They're very small, that are posterior to the thyroid. Now, parathyroid hormone, PTH, increases blood calcium levels. So parathyroid hormone would increase the action of osteoclasts. If your calcium level drops too low, and we've talked about this, calcium level drops too low, You need calcium, as we said several times, for muscle contraction, for the release of neurotransmitters from a synaptic knob, a neuromuscular junction, the release of acetylcholine is dependent upon calcium being present. For the sliding filaments of the muscle, for the muscle contraction, requires calcium. For your nerve impulse, it requires calcium. For many, many, many things. For blood to clot, you need calcium. Calcium is very important, and if blood calcium levels drop, then PTH, parathyroid hormone, is released, and that parathyroid hormone will cause those osteoclasts to break down the bone. So it activates the osteoclast and inhibits the osteoblast, breaks down the bone to release calcium into the bloodstream. And again, you can use that figure 8 model again to compare calcitonin and parathyroid hormone to increase or decrease the calcium levels in the blood. It all has to do with calcium levels in the blood. Now, throughout your body, in the blood vessels and different organs, there are receptors that pick up ion levels in the blood. So calcium levels in the blood, and it will stimulate the release of parathyroid hormone if calcium levels are too low, so that calcium levels can be increased by the action of osteoclasts, and also by the kidney releasing or maintaining calcium levels in the blood instead of excreting them. And also the kidneys would absorb more calcium to be passed on to the bloodstream to be taken where the calcium is needed. So you have several things that help to maintain the calcium levels in the blood, but parathyroid hormone helps to increase. Calcitonin, produced by the thyroid, helps to decrease. So you would have, if the blood calcium's too high, you would have the action of calcitonin to deposit the calcium into the bones, and then if blood calcium's too low, you would have parathyroid hormone release to raise the level of the calcium in the blood. Target organs for parathyroid hormone, we already said. What's the target cells for PTH? Parathyroid hormone would be the cells in the bone cells. They can convert to osteocytes, can convert to osteoclasts to help to break down bones to release the calcium to the bloodstream. To the kidneys would be target cells, so calcium can be conserved, returned to the bloodstream instead of excreted. In the intestines, it absorbs the calcium. Now, here's something about the intestines absorbing calcium we'll learn later on. You have to also have vitamin D, or with vitamin D, calcium is absorbed, returned to the bloodstream instead of excreted, so that blood calcium levels can be restored. So if it's released into the bloodstream, these things can happen, and if the levels are adequate or too high, then the increased blood calcium inhibits PTH secretion. So it's regulated by calcium levels in the blood. This is what stimulates the parathyroid to release parathyroid hormone if the calcium levels are too low. If calcium levels are high enough or too high, then the parathyroid, senses the excess calcium or enough calcium, and so there is inhibition of PTH secretion so that calcium levels can remain in that normal range. Okay, go back over this figure 8 and plug in what happens with blood calcium between parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. So know what the target cells are, the action of those hormones, what gland produces those hormones, and why are those hormones being released. Here's a model you'll be responsible for of the kidney, and sitting on top of the kidney is the adrenal gland. Okay, the adrenal gland has two parts, as I mentioned before. The deeper tissue here is the adrenal medulla, and then several layers of cells make out the outermost layer of the adrenal gland, and that is considered the cortex. We're going to look first at the two hormones produced by the adrenal medulla. Now, epinephrine and norepinephrine, you may have heard of those before. We talked about them back when we were talking about the nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for fight or flight. This happens, these hormones are released in stressful situations, and they are actually released due to nervous stimulation. So the hypothalamus sends the information to the adrenal medulla to release this epinephrine and norepinephrine because of nervous stimulation. Norepinephrine causes more epinephrine to be released, and actually epinephrine is synthesized from norepinephrine or by norepinephrine. It causes an increase of heart rate and blood pressure, it dilates respiratory passageway, decreases digestion. Now, one of the reasons why it decreases digestion is because the blood is being shunted back to these other systems so that the respiratory passageway can receive more blood so that it can send out more oxygen, increases the heart rate so more oxygen and more glucose can be sent to the tissue, so more metabolism can take place, so that more energy can be produced, and you need a lot of oxygen, a lot of glucose, and a delivery system for these things for that fight or flight response, nervous stimulation response. Together, that epinephrine and norepinephrine, because they come from the adrenal gland, is referred to as adrenaline. So fight or flight, a nervous system response, part of the sympathetic nervous system. Let's go to the adrenal cortex. So there are several layers of cells down to the medulla. These outer layers of cells produce different hormones. And if you will recall, the anterior pituitary release to the bloodstream adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adrenal gland, the cortex, and these corticotropic hormones. Okay, one of the corticotropic hormones is mineralocorticotropics, then there's glucocorticotropics and gonatocorticotropics. Aldosterone is the most important mineralocorticoid hormones. It conserves sodium, and aldosterone conserves sodium by reducing sodium output by the kidneys. But at the same time, it increases potassium output. So the body is conserving sodium is triggered, that aldosterone is triggered by low blood sodium, or it may be triggered by high blood potassium, because again it holds on to that sodium and it gets rid of excess potassium. It is also triggered by low blood volume due to blood loss, and also low blood pressure. It is a steroid hormone, so when dehydrated, the body tends to hold on to water. It will also conserve the sodium. It increases blood volume and pressure. So when there's blood loss or low blood pressure, aldosterone is released. It conserves the sodium, holds on to it, reduces sodium output in urine, and increases usually potassium output in the urine. Cortisol. It's the most important glucocorticoid. Glucose metabolism is regulated by cortisol. It is a stress hormone. It provides building blocks to repair the effects of stress. It increases blood glucose, but not usually from sugars. It usually gets this glucose from non-carbohydrates, like amino acids. Amino acids would come from what? Proteins. It also may get the glucose from fats. Okay, so cortisol. It is thought that cortisol increases your desire to take in foods high in fat, and this is a hormone that might be found in the blood for those people who tend to be stress eaters. So this is being researched right now in reducing amount of calorie intake and others. Okay. Glucose metabolism increases glucose metabolism. Adrenal androgens. Whenever you see androgens, think of sex hormones. It is the most important gonadotropin. It provides supplemental sex hormones, supplemental to those produced by the ovaries and the gonads, the ovaries and the testes. Adrenal cortex hormone disorders. Addison's disease, it's an autoimmune disorder in which the cortex does not secrete hormones. All the hormones we discussed there would be affected, or and since it affects the production of the hormones produced by the cortex, it can be lethal in days with Addison's disease. Cushing syndrome is the overproduction of cortisol due to the adrenal tumor or oversecretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. It increases blood glucose and reduces proteins, and reduces protein production for tissue health. It may cause a female to be more masculine looking. It increases the sex hormones, resulting in a change in those secondary sex characteristics. The pancreas. The pancreas is here, and the gallbladder, the small intestines. And in the pancreas, the pancreatic islets are what produces the insulin, the pancreatic islets, the islets of Langerhans, have alpha and beta cells, two different types. Here's a model showing the pancreas. One of the hormones produced by the pancreas is glucagon. It stimulates the liver to break down glycogen. Now, when it breaks down glycogen, what is glycogen? When you take in too many sugars, too much glucose, your body can only use so much. So what happens is that the liver can convert the glucose to glycogen and store it for a short period of time. It's stored in adipose tissue, which is fat, and in the liver. So glucagon stimulates the liver to break down the glycogen to release the glucose to the bloodstream. So when glucose levels are low, break down the glycogen back into glucose. This is released into the blood, so the blood glucose level rises. Okay, glucagon converts glycogen in the liver back to glucose to raise blood glucose levels. This glucagon is produced by alpha cells. Remember that those islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets, have alpha and beta cells. The alpha cells produce glucagon. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels. How? Where are the target cells? In the liver. The liver will respond by breaking down the glycogen into glucose so that blood glucose levels rise. Now, insulin acts in the opposite way. Okay, it decreases blood glucose concentration, so when you eat a meal that is high in sugar, your pancreas should release insulin, and insulin will decrease blood glucose concentration. It lowers blood glucose. It is released when blood glucose is higher, such as when or after you've had a meal. Insulin is produced by beta cells. Diabetes mellitus is type 1, would be insulin-dependent juvenile diabetes. Type 2 is non-insulin dependent. It's also known or called adult onset diabetes because usually type 2 will come on at a later age, sometimes caused by obesity and eating habits. And both can be hereditary, but adult onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is a little more hereditary than the juvenile diabetes, the insulin dependent. Okay, here's our figure 8 again. Insulin and glucagon function together to stabilize blood glucose concentration. When blood glucose is too high, there are receptors that sense the amount of glucose in the blood. Rise in blood glucose receptor, the beta cells detect a rise in blood glucose. The control center, the beta cell, secretes the insulin. The insulin promotes the movement of glucose into certain cells. It stimulates the formation of glycogen. If there's too much glucose, the excess is stored as glycogen in the liver and in the muscles and in adipose tissue. The response, the blood glucose level drops to normal, and then the production of insulin will stop. Now, if blood glucose drops too low, receptors in the alpha cell detect the drop in blood glucose. Alpha cells will secrete glucagon. Glucagon stimulates the cells to break in the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. It could be in the muscles and adipose tissue also, but mostly in the liver. So those would be the target cells for glucagon. The glycogen is broken down into glucose. It stimulates the cell to convert the non-carbohydrates into glucose. Non-carbohydrates would be proteins and fats into glucose. So that would increase the blood glucose levels, return it closer to normal, and then you have normal blood glucose concentration, and the whole cycle can begin again. The pineal gland produces melatonin. It is, now here we saw the pituitary gland, more posterior to the thalamus. It's going to be this area here is where the pineal gland is found. It regulates weight and sleep rhythm. It monitors light conditions outside of the body. The retina also monitors or will respond to light, and it raises the amount of melatonin. Dark decreases the amount of melatonin, and it helps to establish a circadian rhythm or sleep-wake patterns or rhythms. Okay, the pineal gland, melatonin. The thymus gland produces thymosins. Thymosins promotes development of certain white blood cells. It affects the production and differentiation of certain white blood cells, mainly lymphocytes, which you will learn more about shortly. The thymus is more active and more pronounced, is larger in children or young adults, and becomes smaller in adults. It still remains somewhat active, but it will become smaller in adults. Very pronounced and large in children and smaller in adults. Other endocrine glands, you have reproductive glands. The ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone. We'll talk more about this when we talk about get into the reproductive system. The testes secretes testosterone. And that is the end of our chapter 11, the endocrine system.